I knew I was different in my family long before I had the words to explain it, long before I understood what it meant to be the child who was tolerated rather than loved. My name is Ethan Parker, and I grew up in a modest three-bedroom house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with my parents Richard and Diane Parker and my younger sister Megan, who was 2 years behind me but somehow always 10 steps ahead in everything that mattered in our household. From the earliest memories I can trace, Megan was the sun and I was the shadow. When Megan brought home a B+ on her report card, my mother would frame it on the refrigerator and call our grandparents to brag about how brilliant her little girl was. But when I brought home straight A's, my father would glance at the paper, nod once, and say something like, "That's what you're supposed to do. Don't expect a parade for doing the bare minimum." I remember being 7 years old and winning the school spelling bee. Standing on that little stage in the gymnasium with a cheap plastic trophy in my hands and scanning the audience for my parents' faces, only to find 2 empty seats because Megan had a ballet recital across town that started 30 minutes later, and my mother insisted they couldn't risk being late for it. So they simply chose not to come to mine at all. When I came home that evening holding my trophy with the biggest smile I could muster, hoping that maybe seeing the physical proof would make them proud, my mother barely looked up from braiding Megan's hair and said, "That's nice, honey, put it in your room," and my father was already asleep on the couch. I put that trophy on my dresser and stared at it for an hour that night, trying to figure out what was wrong with me, what invisible defect I carried that made me so easy to overlook. As the years went on, the pattern didn't just continue, it deepened into something cruel and systematic. Megan learned very early that she could weaponize our parents' favoritism, and she did so with a precision that was almost sociopathic for a child her age. When she was 9 and I was 11, she broke my mother's favorite ceramic vase while playing ball inside the house, something we were both forbidden from doing. And when my mother came running at the sound of the crash, Megan simply pointed at me with tears already streaming down her face and said, "Ethan threw the ball at me and it hit the vase," and without a single question. Without even looking at me for my side of the story, my mother grabbed me by the arm, dragged me to my room, and grounded me for 2 weeks. I screamed that it wasn't me, that I had been reading a book on the couch the entire time, that Megan was the one playing with the ball. But my words hit the closed door like stones against a fortress. That became Megan's signature move: do something wrong, cry first, point at Ethan, and watch the consequences land on someone else. She scratched my father's car with her bicycle and told him I did it out of anger, and he took away my bicycle for the entire summer. She stole $20 from my mother's purse and planted the evidence in my backpack. And I got lectured for 45 minutes about how stealing was the lowest thing a person could do, while Megan sat at the kitchen table eating ice cream with an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped trying to defend myself because I realized that the verdict was always decided before the trial even began. My parents didn't want the truth, they wanted confirmation of the story they had already written in their minds. Megan was the good child and Ethan was the problem. I threw myself into academics and sports. Not because I still hoped to earn their approval, but because I understood with a clarity that no teenager should have to possess, that the only person who was going to build a future for me was me. I ran track, maintained a 4 GPA, worked a part-time job at the local hardware store, and saved every dollar I earned in a shoebox under my bed because I knew that when the time came to leave, there would be no safety net, no parental fund, no tearful goodbye at a college dormitory door. Meanwhile, Megan floated through high school on charm and manipulation, surrounded by friends she would later betray, dating boys she would later discard. and failing classes that my parents would blame on bad teachers rather than her own laziness. The contrast between how we were treated was so stark that even outsiders noticed it. My track coach, Mr. Henderson, once pulled me aside after practice and asked me quietly if everything was okay at home, because he said I carried myself like a kid who had learned to make himself small. And I didn't know what to say, so I just told him I was fine and ran another lap. My English teacher, Mrs. Calloway, wrote in my senior yearbook, "You are seen, even when you feel invisible. And you are worth more than you know." And I didn't cry when I read it, but I kept that yearbook long after I threw away almost everything else from that house. Graduation came and went without ceremony. My parents attended but spent most of the evening talking about Megan's upcoming junior prom, and that summer I worked double shifts, packed one suitcase, and applied to a state university 3 hours away with the money I had saved and a partial academic scholarship I had earned entirely on my own. The night before I left for college, I sat at the dinner table for the last time and looked at my family, really looked at them. And I saw it all so clearly. My father, who never once told me he was proud of me, my mother, who never once chose me first, and my sister, who had built her entire identity on making sure I was always the villain in every story. I didn't say anything dramatic, I didn't confront them, I simply finished my meal, washed my plate, went to my room and closed the door. Because I had learned the hardest lesson a child can learn, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. And the only revenge worth having is becoming someone they can no longer ignore. College was the first time in my life I could breathe without measuring how much space I was allowed to take up, and for 2 years I thrived in ways I never thought possible. I made real friends who actually listened when I spoke. I earned a spot on the dean's list every semester. I joined the debate team and discovered I had a voice that people respected. And I even started dating a girl named Sophie who looked at me like I was somebody worth knowing. And for the first time in 20 years I started to believe that maybe my parents were wrong about me. Maybe I wasn't the broken one after all. I still called home every few weeks out of obligation more than desire, and the conversations were always the same. My mother would talk about Megan for 15 minutes. Ask me if I needed money, which I never did, and then hang up without asking a single meaningful question about my life. And my father would occasionally grunt a hello in the background but never actually take the phone. I had made peace with it, or at least I had built enough emotional scar tissue that the cuts didn't bleed the way they used to. And I told myself that once I graduated and built a career, I would maintain a polite distance from my family and live my life on my own terms without bitterness and without dependency. But Megan had other plans, because Megan always had other plans, and what she did in the spring of my junior year was so calculated, so devastatingly precise, that it didn't just damage our relationship, it detonated my entire family in a single phone call. It started when Megan got caught shoplifting from a department store in Cedar Falls, not a small thing either. She had walked out with over $800 worth of designer clothes and jewelry stuffed in an oversized bag, and when store security detained her and called the police, she was facing a misdemeanor theft charge that would go on her record. My parents were horrified, not because their daughter had committed a crime, but because the neighbors might find out, because the family reputation might be scratched. And they confronted Megan at home, demanding to know what she was thinking. And this is where Megan did what Megan had always done. She cried, she made herself the victim, and she pointed at me. According to what my mother screamed at me over the phone 2 days later, Megan had told them that I had been financially abusing her for years. That I had borrowed large amounts of money from her and never paid it back, that I had manipulated her into giving me her savings to fund my college lifestyle, and that she had resorted to shoplifting because she was broke and desperate and too ashamed to tell anyone what her own brother had done to her. The lie was so outrageous, so completely disconnected from reality, that when my mother first said the words, I actually laughed. Which was the worst thing I could have done, because my mother took that laugh as confirmation of guilt, as arrogance, as proof that I was exactly the monster Megan had described. I tried to explain that I hadn't taken a single cent from anyone in my family since the day I left for college, that I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't, that I had bank statements and pay stubs that could prove every dollar I earned was my own, but my mother wasn't listening. She was crying and yelling and saying things like, "How could you do this to your sister? And we always knew something was wrong with you, and your father is so disgusted he can't even speak to you." And I stood in my tiny dorm room holding the phone with a shaking hand and realized that nothing I said would matter. That the trial was already over, that the verdict had been handed down the same way it always had been. Megan speaks, Ethan pays. My father called me the next day, and his voice was cold in a way I had never heard before, not angry but finished, like he was closing an account that had been in the red for too long. And he told me that I was no longer welcome in their home, that they were cutting me off completely, that I should not call, should not visit, should not contact Megan ever again. And that as far as he was concerned, he had only one child. I remember the exact moment the call ended, because I stood there holding the silent phone for nearly 3 minutes just staring at the wall, and I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything. I just felt something inside me go quiet, like a pilot light that had been flickering for years finally going out, and in its place was nothing, not anger, not sadness. Just a vast, empty silence that tasted like the truth I had always known but never wanted to accept. That my parents had been looking for a reason to let me go my entire life, and Megan had simply gift-wrapped it for them. Sophie found me sitting on the floor of my dorm room an hour later, and she held me while I told her everything, not just about the phone call but about all of it, the vase, the bicycle, the $20, the empty seats at the spelling bee, the years of being the wrong child in the right family. And she cried harder than I did, because I think she understood something that I was still too numb to process, that I hadn't just lost my family that day. I had finally been forced to admit that I never really had one. The next few weeks were mechanical. I went to class, I went to work, I ate, I slept. I functioned, but inside I was rebuilding my entire identity from the foundation up, because everything I had ever been was defined in relation to them. I was Richard's disappointing son, Diane's difficult child, Megan's scapegoat, and now that those titles had been officially revoked, I had to figure out who Ethan Parker was when he belonged to no one. And that question was the hardest thing I had ever faced. Harder than any exam, harder than any race, harder than any night spent wondering why I wasn't enough. Because for the first time in my life, the answer was entirely up to me. I graduated with honors the following year, and Sophie was the only person sitting in the audience who was there specifically for me. And when I walked across that stage and accepted my degree in finance, I didn't scan the crowd for empty seats the way I had at the spelling bee, because I had trained myself to stop looking for people who were never going to show up. And that single shift in mindset was the thing that saved me more than any degree or job ever could. Sophie and I moved to Chicago together that summer, into a tiny studio apartment with a leaking faucet and a radiator that clanged like a percussion instrument every night. And I took an entry-level position at a financial consulting firm where I worked 12-hour days, volunteered for every project nobody else wanted, and slowly, methodically, relentlessly climbed. Not because I was trying to prove anything to my parents, but because I had spent my entire childhood being told I was not enough, and I had converted that pain into fuel that burned cleaner and hotter than any motivation born from privilege ever could. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior analyst. Within 3 years, I was managing my own team. And by the time 5 years had passed since that final phone call with my father, I was earning a 6-figure salary, owned a 2-bedroom condo overlooking Lake Michigan, and had built a life that was so structurally sound that no one from my past could shake it even if they tried. Sophie and I got engaged on a quiet Tuesday evening because we didn't need spectacle, we just needed each other. And the small circle of friends who came to our engagement dinner became the family I had chosen, people who showed up not out of obligation but because they genuinely wanted to be there. And I remember looking around that table and thinking, this is what it's supposed to feel like, this warmth that doesn't come with conditions. This love that doesn't require you to shrink so someone else can expand. I had not spoken to my parents or Megan in 5 years, and I had made a deliberate decision not to search for information about them because I understood that healing required distance, and curiosity was just a disguised form of attachment. So I built a wall not out of hatred but out of necessity, and I lived behind it peacefully. But life has a way of delivering information whether you ask for it or not, and it came to me through my cousin Rebecca, my mother's niece, who had always been quietly sympathetic to me even during the years when the rest of the family treated me like a cautionary tale. Rebecca and I had reconnected through social media about a year after I moved to Chicago, and she would occasionally send me updates that I never requested but couldn't stop myself from reading. And through her I learned that the golden child's crown had started to rust almost immediately after I was cut off. Megan had dropped out of college after one semester because she said the professors were unfair and the coursework was beneath her, which was the same entitlement repackaged in academic language. And she moved back home where my parents supported her financially while she drifted between part-time jobs she quit within weeks and relationships she burned through like matches. She dated a man named Tyler who my parents adored because he came from money and had a real estate license. But Rebecca told me that Tyler was controlling and reckless and that Megan mistook his possessiveness for passion. And within a year they were engaged in a toxic cycle of explosive arguments, public scenes, and dramatic reconciliations that exhausted everyone around them. My parents poured money into Megan's lifestyle trying to stabilize her. They co-signed a lease on an apartment she couldn't afford. They paid off credit card debt she accumulated buying things she didn't need. They bailout her out of a second shoplifting incident that they managed to get reduced to a fine through a local attorney, and Rebecca said it was like watching two people try to fill a bathtub that had no bottom. Every dollar and every excuse just drained away and left them more depleted than before. My father took a second mortgage on the house to cover Megan's debts, and my mother started working extra shifts at the hospital where she was a receptionist. And the strain cracked their marriage in ways that were visible even to outsiders. They stopped going to church together, they stopped hosting holiday dinners. And neighbors whispered that Richard was sleeping in the guest room. Meanwhile, Megan's relationship with Tyler finally imploded when he left her for someone else, and she responded by maxing out 3 credit cards in a single weekend and crashing her car into a fire hydrant while driving under the influence, which earned her a DUI, a suspended license, and a court-mandated substance abuse program that she attended for 2 sessions before quitting because she said she didn't have a problem and the counselor was judging her. Rebecca told me all of this not with satisfaction, but with a heavy sadness. And she said something that stayed with me. She said, "Your parents spent so long protecting Megan from consequences that they forgot consequences are how people learn. And now she doesn't know how to survive anything real." I read that message sitting in my office on the 32nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago. And I felt something complicated move through me, not vindication exactly, not joy at her suffering, but a deep, exhausted recognition that everything I had always seen was now visible to everyone else, that the golden child was never golden at all, she was just gilded. A thin layer of shine over something hollow, and now the coating was flaking off, and what was left underneath was a person who had never once been required to be real, to be accountable, to be anything other than believed. And that was perhaps the cruelest thing my parents ever did, not what they did to me but what they did to her. Because they loved her so badly that they forgot to teach her how to stand on her own. And now she was falling, and there was nothing beneath her but the hard ground of a world that did not care whose favorite she was. The call came on a Wednesday night at 11:47. And I know the exact time because I was lying in bed next to Sophie reviewing a client proposal on my laptop when my phone lit up with an unknown number from Cedar Falls, and something in my chest tightened before I even answered. Some ancient instinct that recognized the area code the way a soldier recognizes the sound of a specific weapon. And when I picked up, the voice on the other end was not my mother's or my father's but a nurse at Mercy General Hospital who asked if I was Ethan Parker and if I was related to Megan Parker. And when I said yes, she told me that Megan had been brought into the emergency room 3 hours ago following a severe car accident, that she had significant internal bleeding and a ruptured spleen, and that she needed an emergency blood transfusion and potentially a living donor for a partial liver transplant. And that Megan had a rare blood type, B negative, which I already knew because it was the same as mine. And that neither of my parents were a match, and the blood bank was critically low, and they had found my name listed as a biological sibling in her medical records, and were reaching out to ask if I would be willing to come in for testing. I sat there in the dark holding the phone, and I felt the entire weight of 27 years of history pressing down on my chest. The spelling bee, the vase, the bicycle, the $20. The empty seats, the shoplifting lie. My father's voice saying he had only one child, and Sophie was sitting up now watching me with wide, careful eyes because she could read my silence the way most people read words. And when I hung up and told her what had happened, she didn't tell me what to do. She just took my hand and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." And that sentence was worth more than anything my parents had ever said to me in my entire life. I drove to Cedar Falls that night, 5 hours through dark, empty highways with nothing but my thoughts and the hum of the engine. And I won't pretend I didn't consider turning around at least 3 times, because every mile that brought me closer to that town brought me closer to people who had discarded me like a defective product. And the part of me that had spent 5 years healing kept whispering that I didn't owe them anything, that blood type doesn't equal obligation, that shared DNA is not a debt. But there was another part of me, a quieter part, the part that Mrs. Calloway had seen when she wrote, "You are worth more than you know," and that part understood something that anger would never teach me, that who I chose to be in this moment had nothing to do with who they were and everything to do with who I had become. I arrived at Mercy General at 4 in the morning, and the first person I saw in the waiting room was my mother, and she looked like she had aged 15 years in the 5 that had passed. Her hair was gray and thin, and her face was swollen from crying, and when she saw me she froze like she was looking at a ghost, and then she broke, not gracefully but completely. She collapsed into a chair and sobbed and said my name over and over like a prayer she had forgotten she knew. And my father was sitting 3 chairs away staring at the floor, and he didn't look up when I walked in, but I saw his hands trembling and I saw the shame in the curve of his spine. The posture of a man who had finally run out of ways to avoid the truth. I didn't hug them, I didn't yell at them, I simply walked to the nurse's station and told them I was there for the blood test, and over the next 2 hours I was typed, tested, and confirmed as a viable donor for both the transfusion and the partial liver transplant. And when the surgeon explained the risks to me, pain, recovery time, potential complications, I signed the consent forms without hesitation, not because Megan deserved it, but because I refused to become the kind of person my family had always accused me of being. The surgery happened the following morning and it was successful. Megan's bleeding was controlled and the liver graft took, and the doctors said she would need months of recovery, but she would survive. And when I woke up in my own hospital bed with a dull, aching fire in my abdomen, Sophie was there holding my hand and Rebecca was there with flowers, and my mother was standing in the doorway looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something raw and unfinished, and she said, "Ethan, I need to tell you something." And then she told me that Megan had confessed everything 2 weeks before the accident. That during one of her court-mandated therapy sessions that she had actually attended this time, the therapist had pushed her to examine her patterns of dishonesty, and Megan had broken down and admitted to my parents that she had lied about the money, that I had never taken anything from her, that she had fabricated the entire story because she was scared of the shoplifting consequences, and she knew that blaming me would redirect their anger the way it always had. And my mother said that she and my father had been trying to figure out how to contact me, how to apologize, how to even begin to address what they had done. When the accident happened and the universe forced the reunion, they were too cowardly to initiate themselves. I looked at my mother and I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, because forgiveness is not a moment, it is a process. But I felt the wall I had built crack just enough to let in a sliver of light, and I said, "I need time." And she nodded, and for the first time in my life she didn't argue, she didn't minimize. She didn't redirect, she simply accepted what I needed, and I think that single moment of genuine respect was the first honest thing she ever gave me. I left Cedar Falls 2 weeks later with a scar on my abdomen and a weight off my chest, and Sophie drove us home to Chicago while I slept in the passenger seat. And in the months that followed, my parents wrote me letters, real letters, not texts, not calls, but handwritten pages that smelled like the house I grew up in, and they were clumsy and imperfect, and sometimes they still made excuses, but they were trying. And Megan sent me one letter that simply said, "I'm sorry for all of it, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that you saved my life in more ways than one." And I kept that letter in the same drawer where I still kept Mrs. Calloway's yearbook message, because both of them said the same thing in different ways: "You are seen, you are real, you are enough, and you always were."